I just want to introduce myself. I'm Susie Brown. I'm regional director for Bridges for Women for South and Southeast Asia. So those of you who are in Indonesia and a lot of the Philippines and places like that, I have been, and so I'm excited about that. I have been in Africa. My husband and I both have been in Africa too. Some other places, but mainly this is where we're focused. And so I train women to take stories of the Bible that are about women and for women, and match them to issues and needs with the women that they work with in their ministries. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through kind of what is orality. And then I want to do a demonstration of a story and discussing it and kind of how we do it overseas. I'm going to let my husband do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to start.
Okay, yeah, I'm Tim, and so Susie and I have been married 44 years. We live in Tucson, Arizona, have 2 grown children and a couple of grandkids and 3 cats here. We've both worked with scriptures in use over time and got our roots in orality, but I currently work with a ministry called Vision Synergy that focuses on collaboration. How do we help missionaries, churches, missions collaborate, work together to be in unity as Jesus has commanded it? And the connections here, in addition to orality, for a while I was an advisor to the Global Chain Network, which is how I met many of my friends who are involved in the Chase strategy. So yeah, so I'll give it back to my wife and we'll just press on.
Yeah. Susie, you're muted, but just before you begin, let me give one more, because we had one more person join us. We are recording this, and if you have security concerns, we would ask you to turn your video off and change your name, but otherwise we'll be recording.
All right. Sorry about that. My grandson came in to ask me a question. This is what happens when you work from home on Zoom. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to share I'd like to share my screen with you, and I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I would not do this overseas when I'm training, but I like to do this whenever I'm with a group such as we are, because it just makes it easier to visually see a lot of this information. So I'm going to share the screen right now. Those of you may not see me. Some of you may not. Some of you may. It depends on your capabilities of what you're viewing on, if you're viewing on a computer or a phone. So here I go. Okay. Can everybody see this? Can everyone see this? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, because I'm full screen here and I can't see here. So I want to talk about oral cultures and literate cultures, and I want to talk about what makes them different. And I specifically want to talk about women. And because I work with women, that's one thing that is my ministry. And so women are the majority of 2.5 billion people in the world who cannot read or write. We like to actually refer to that as oral preference learners. And they're used to hearing long verbal stories that are passed down through their grandparents or just through certain important people in the villages. And this is where they get their worldview, their values, and their traditions. And a lot of times they'll not only tell the stories from memory, but they will sing the stories, they'll chant the stories. And it's just a part of their culture. And so, and so even though they're different in this way, they're very much the same as we are, because they have the same problems, the same issues, and needs. We're all the same, all around the world. But the only thing that makes it different is that they communicate differently than we do. But they all are a part of the oral culture. So I want to talk a little bit about Jesus. Jesus was, and I want to quote this scripture from Matthew 13:34-35. All Jesus did that day was tell stories, a long storytelling afternoon. His storytelling fulfilled the prophecy, I will open my mouth and tell stories. I will bring out into the open things hidden since the world's first day. And, you know, Jesus really did communicate through stories, through parables. And he also spoke to the people in their common language, their language that was their mother tongue language, which was Aramaic at the time. And so he saw the importance of that. He saw the importance of communicating stories in their language. And it was a very effective way of actually reaching people of that day. I want to talk about the Bible, and that 75% of the Bible is stories and narrative. 15% is poetry and proverbs. 10% is letters, concepts and ideas. And I think that's really important to look at that, to see that the Bible is broken up into those different parts, and that 75% is stories and narrative. Oops, sorry, back here. And then I just want to talk a little bit about communication styles between literate or book culture versus non-literate or traditional cultures. So as you can see here, on the literate side, we're analytical, we're expository, we like to outline everything, summarize, we like to pull things apart and divide them into parts. We like to study things. We like to preach and teach. And then we're very individualistic. We like to do things individually. In non-literate or traditional cultures, oral cultures, they really listen. They like to listen. And then they like repetition. They like to repeat things over and over again. They like to hear it not only over and over again, but they like to hear it in different ways. So that could be hearing the story through a song, through a drama, through a poem. And in doing that, you're actually hearing the story repeated over and over again. They like narratives. They're event oriented. They're holistic. So they like, they don't like to pull things apart. They like everything all as a whole. They like stories and dramas and music. They like to memorize. So, and a lot of people that I've seen when I've done trainings at the grassroots level, some of the women in the villages they can memorize a story after hearing it 1 or 2 times. It's amazing how their memories are. And then they're community oriented. So literate cultures really focus on reading the story. Oral cultures, hear the story, memorize the story, tell the story, act the story, drum the story, sing the story, dance the story, live the story, and finally love the story. So what do we do with Bible stories? And there is a strategy. So using appropriate stories, so stories that connect to issues and needs in someone's life, that can be so effective when you're working in oral cultures. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And sequence. Sequence meaning stories that start from the very beginning of the Bible and go all the way through to the end of the Bible, so that it becomes a complete chronological stories. Disciple. And so stories that will help people grow in their walk in the Lord. And there you can actually, there are stories that you can use that will do that. So I want to talk a little bit about choosing the right story. So this kind of will give you a little bit of an idea of how stories can connect to issues and needs and problems in women's lives. Stories that address the human needs, which such as hunger and poverty. The Widow's Oil is a really good story for that. When you're talking about losing a child, the daughter of Jephthah, class and barriers and racism, the women at the well, equality and justice, a mother's request, troubling dreams, wife of Pilate has a dream, motherhood, 2 women and a baby. And so this is just an example of some of the stories and how they can connect to issues and needs in women's lives. I want to talk a little bit about scriptures and use is unique in the way where we've actually identified 120 stories in the Bible about women and for women. And so we call that the Women's Story Collection. And I have that available. And so I can actually send the whole 120 stories to Paula and then have her distribute that to anybody who's interested in that story list. And the story list is broken up into different categories. And in the categories is the name of the story and then the scripture that is connected to that. But I just want to kind of go through, the different categories so you can get an idea of what they are. So of course we have the chronological stories, God's story for women, essentials from Genesis to John. So from the beginning of the Bible all the way through. We have New Testament stories. We have Old Testament stories and New Testament stories. We have stories of motherhood, stories of suffering and sorrow, of comfort, of wisdom, of love, of infertility, of cunning, aggression, and manipulation. Stories of women who followed Jesus, inheritance stories, and stories of refugees, and stories of honor and shame. So now what I'd like to do is, after going through a little bit about what orality is all about, I want to actually demonstrate this. And so I'm going to actually I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can come back because I like to be able to tell the story. I'm going to tell the story from memorization. So I've memorized the story. It's a simple story. So it's a short story and a simple story. I'm probably very familiar to most of you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the story several times. And I want you to listen to the story. And just the first time, listen. The second time, I want you to close your eyes and listen. And the third time, I'll just go through it again. Okay. And so this is the story of Mary and Martha, which is a very familiar story. So I'm going to start. One day, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, they came to a village where a woman named Martha invited them into her home. Now, Martha had a sister, and her name was Mary. Mary sat at the feet of Jesus, listening to everything he had to say. Martha was concerned about all the things that needed to be done. So she went to Jesus and she said, "Master, don't you care that my sister has left me with everything to do?" And Jesus said to her, "Martha, Martha, why, you are concerned about many things, but only one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen what is best." And Mary has chosen what is better, and that will not be taken away from her. Okay, I'm going to tell it again. And this time I want you to close your eyes and kind of listen to the story and visualize the story, okay? One day, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, they came to a village where a woman named Martha invited them into her home. And Martha had a sister, and her name was Mary. And she sat at the feet of Jesus, listening to everything he had to say. Martha was concerned about all the things that needed to be done. And so she said to Jesus, "Master, don't you care that my sister has left me with everything to do?" Jesus said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and concerned about many things, but only one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen what is better, and that will not be taken away from her." All right, one more time, and you can choose to keep your eyes closed or you can open them, right? One day, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, they came to a village where a woman named Martha invited them into her home. Martha had a sister, and her name was Mary. She sat at the feet of Jesus, listening to everything he had to say. And Martha was concerned about all the things that needed to be done. And so she went to Jesus and she said, "Master, don't you care that my sister has left me with everything to be done?" And Jesus said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and concerned about many things, but only one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen what is better. That will not be taken away from her." Okay, so you've heard the story 3 times. And remember how I said in oral cultures, they like repetition, and that's how they memorize. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through the story with questions, and you're going to help me retell the story. Okay. So one day, Jesus and his disciples were on their way. Who did they meet? Oh, you can unmute, and whoever wants to. Sorry, I forgot to say that. So who did they meet?
Martha.
Martha. Martha had a sister. What was her name?
Mary.
Mary. And what was Mary doing?
She sat at the feet of Jesus, listening
Yes.
to everything he taught.
Yes, she listening to everything he had to say. Now, what did Martha do? What did she do? What did she say? She went to Jesus, and what did she say to Jesus?
She said, Master, don't you care?
Oh, you know what? Let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, Martha was concerned about something. What was she concerned about?
Many things.
Many things. Everything that had to be done. And so then she went to Jesus, and what did she say?
Don't you care?
Master, don't you care that? What did she say about her sister?
That
She
Mary
said-
left her with all of the things to be done.
Yes, that my sister has left me with all the things to be done. And what did Jesus say to her? He said something important. What did he say?
He said that she had chosen the better thing.
Yes. And before that, he said, he called her name, didn't he? What did he say? Martha,
Martha.
Martha, Martha, you are, what did he say about her?
Worried about many things.
You're worried and concerned about many things, but then, I don't know who said it, but only one thing is needed. And what was the one thing? That was that. And who chose the one thing?
He said, Mary has chosen the better thing and it will not be taken from her.
Perfect. Great. Wonderful. All right. So I've gone through the story 3 times, and then we've all walked through it with questions. And they're just simple questions, and they start from the very beginning of the story and they go all the way through to the end. And so they really are there to really discuss the story and really to help memorize the story. At this point, what I would do, and if somebody's really, really brave, would somebody like to try to retell the story? You don't have to be perfect at this point. We do, of course, because we're passing on God's word. We want it to be word for word, but as we're learning the story, it's okay if we make mistakes, because as a community, we can all kind of help correct each other. That's what happens in oral cultures.
I'll give it a go.
Okay, give it a go.
Yay, Ruth.
So Jesus and his disciples were walking on their way, and they came to a village, and a woman named Martha came out to meet them, and she invited Jesus into her home. Martha had a sister named Mary, and Mary sat at the feet of Jesus, listening to everything he had to say. Martha was busy or concerned with all the things that needed to be done. And so she went to Jesus and she said, Master, don't you care? My sister Mary has left me to do all the things that need to be done. And Jesus turned to Martha and he said, Martha, Martha, You are concerned about many things, but your sister Mary has chosen what is better, and this will not be taken from her.
Wow, round of
Hey,
applause.
that was really good. That was really good. Okay, let me tell the story one more time. Okay. Oh, I like all that little hands clapping. That's nice. So I'll listen to the story and I'll tell the story again. One day, Jesus and his disciples were on their way when they came to a village where a woman named Martha invited them into her home. Martha had a sister and her name was Mary. And Mary sat at the feet of Jesus listening to everything he had to say. And Martha was concerned about all the things that needed to be done. And so she went to Jesus and she said, Master, don't you care that my sister has left me with everything to be done? And Jesus said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and concerned about many things, but only one thing is needed. And Mary has chosen what is better, and that will not be taken away from her. Okay. All right. So we've just walked through. We've told the story, and I had someone try to retell the story, and we probably would have maybe a couple more people tell the story, try to tell the story. But for the sake of time, we're not going to do that. But I wanted you to really see how effective this is to really tell the story. I could read the story, but really telling the story from memory, it just places it in your heart. And I've probably, I'd like to say I've memorized more stories, but I've probably memorized about 6 stories that I use over and over again when I'm training. When I train overseas, I don't particularly become the storyteller. I like to actually, I may demonstrate a story at the beginning, but I really want them to make the story their own and in their own culture and their own cultural style. And so, but it is great to see it demonstrated. So I'm going to go back to the sharing my screen so I can show you one more thing. I just want to talk a little bit about dialogue questions and how we do it. There are many different ways that or different orality methods do dialogue questions. We like to do it this way. It's very simple, and it really does get into the discussion of the story and opens up a lot about the story and discovery for people. And so dialogue questions, I walked through the story with questions, and we like to talk about how we're really asking questions about the story that are in the story. And so not asking a question that's outside the story, but asking a question that's within the story, and staying within the story is important. And then starting from the beginning of the story and going all the way to the end is important. And then we use who, what, when, where, and how questions. And they're simple, and they become very effective. And as your partners or the people that you're working with get more and more familiar with this, they'll get into deeper discussion questions about the story. And that's where it really starts to affect their lives, and they start having self-discovery about the story and what is it saying to them. And we do try to avoid why questions, because that can take people on rabbit trails, and if it's not in the story, it can, you're really guessing, you can get really sometimes off track when you use a why question, unless it's actually in the story. Okay, so I'm gonna have you think about questions that you'd like to ask. But right now what I like to do is have my husband, Tim, sorry, go back to this. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I'm gonna have my husband, Tim, actually talk about community health and transformation stories that he and I have worked with and developed with the ministry we're with. And I wanted him to talk about that because he really is good at that. So,
well, what Susie asked me to talk a little bit about is in 2012 and 13, Susie and I were invited by Wycliffe India to work with a couple of their teams to pilot test this orality as it would apply to community transformation stories, in addition to Bible stories. So how do you take these principles of orality that Susie's talked about and begin to apply them to helping with Che lessons, for which you all are very familiar with? And so we spent about a year going back and forth a couple weeks at a time with two teams. And of course, Wycliffe, they're the experts at Bible translation. So how do you tell the stories in mother tongue languages and make audio recordings of the telling of the story? They would create songs about a Bible story. They would create audio dramas, because this was to put on an MP3 player. And then the piece that we were bringing was, how would you apply that to a Che lesson? And so, or to any community health. And so we took them through workshop activities to identify the needs, what might be the needs. And some of the needs they identified obviously were the community hygiene kind of stories. Maybe there were societal stories. Susie and I, as we were talking about it today, remember we heard there was a lot of misinformation that would be given to pregnant women because of traditions in Indian context and culture. So sometimes women would be told they shouldn't eat because they would get large, and that would be difficult. They would get large if they ate, and they wanted to keep their size. And so there's a lot of misinformation.
It also had to do with their mother-in-law told them not to. And so that's important because culturally, in India, mother-in-law has everything to do with it.
But the concept was really, how could they create audio recordings of stories, songs, dramas that would convey the information? And many of them, a source they would use would be the Che lesson catalog. What were the Che lessons that applied to issues in their context or culture? Then we would have them research, because just like we wanted biblical accuracy, we wanted scientific accuracy, meaning that whatever they were going to be telling the stories should be accurate to the medical, medical profession, even though. So they began to create stories like of a young man, got sick, and the mother took him to the witch doctor, and the witch doctor wasn't able to help. So they took him to the clinic, and when they went to the clinic, this is what they were advised to do, and the young boy got healthy. Oral people like concrete stories. They relate to the characters in those stories. So you can take these principles that Susie's been demonstrating for Bible stories and begin to think in an oral culture, how might you create stories, songs, dramas that communicate community health issues to a village. One, we were working among Angika speakers, and they're in a eastern Bihar state, a poor area. And this one man created a hilarious story and song where he was teaching people the proper ways to take a bath. And he even put motions to it of scrubbing your nails and washing your hair. And when he went to the village, he was quite the hit. All the children loved learning the song and loved doing those things. Now you have to be careful, because one of our colleagues decided to write some stories from the Western perspective that he said we should just give to them and they could translate. And so he created a story about a little boy named Billy who lived in a house where they let the cat come and the dogs come into the house and they pooped in the house, and that was creating a hygiene problem. What we didn't know is Billy in Hindi is the word for cat. And so it got confusing because they were thinking that the story was about the cat, not about a little boy. And so we have to be careful as we take these things across culture. But I guess the outcome is to think about in women's cycle of life, as Susie said, you identify stories of issues and can match them to Bible stories, which can help. But you can also begin to help these communities create their own stories, songs, dramas, ways of acting out the information that you're trying to give. So that was our venture into how to use orality or oral methods to communicate important information. I think I've covered what you asked me to.
Yeah.
And so I do think we're ready for just questions. And while you're doing that, I guess, Susie, we can put our emails in the chat box if anybody wants to follow up. And we've got the story list and Susie's PowerPoint we can make available to you all. But maybe we should turn it back over to Paula to moderate questions.
Yeah.
Or
hold on. One more thing I wanted to talk about that I didn't talk about as much which is so important to oral cultures, is it's not just about the story. It's about putting the song, the drama, the poems, dance to the stories. And that's one thing we do in our trainings. And at the end, they actually perform the story through all of that. And it's so beautiful to see that and how they come alive, because that's a part of their culture, and how they just really live the story. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that, because I didn't really go over that as much. But yes, if we can go ahead and have Paula come back.
Thank you so much. I'm like hidden here, but thank you. This has been so helpful. And I just wanted to open this up to questions or comments that any of you might have for Susie, Tim, for the group.
Question for both is, as you just shared, you mentioned it's helpful to have stories come alive, as my notes in poetry, drama, and music. Is that entirely left to the group that you are ministering and talking to, or as Tim maybe referred to, are there ever times you bring that to the table and share the story in that form? Is it up to them or up to you as the presenter, or at times some of both, to take that step from the story to other means of communicating and bringing the story to life and making it memorable?
You want to answer that, Tim?
you give me the tough ones, boy.
I know.
It's really about both. I think one thing that we've learned about oral cultures is they like to replicate. All the research, they like to replicate. So if you can model things, they'll want to replicate it. Now, the danger of replication is if you model it as a Westerner, do they try and replicate? We were working with this group in Eastern Bihar, and somebody had given them a Casio, electric piano, and it had the Western drum beats. So they went off to create music in their own context, and they came back with this country Western drum beat that was totally out of sync with their music. So, we have to be careful of understanding what is cultural and then encouraging them to be creative. So I would say Susie and I have modeled stories, but we're also always careful when we introduce that to say, this is how we would do it in the West, but we want you to work on how would you do it in your culture and in your context.
And if you were in one of my trainings, that would be part of the training, to talk about, how different cultures tell stories. In the Muslim traditions, they lay on the floor and they tell stories like this. Some cultures tell it under a tree, they gather under a tree. So we talk about the different ways, sitting, standing. In Ghana, Africa, they sit, and all of the story is told from their waist up, and they get really animated. So there are different ways, and we could never really know all of those ways in different cultures. And so for us, we really find the best way is to have them create that, because they know best how their culture would do it. It's exciting to see too.
I'll let guest one and then Ruth.
Hi, the question is for Susie, or maybe Tim actually answered part of it. As you were talking earlier, Susie, you said something about that when you're overseas, you might only use like one demo story. And then you would like them to culturally make the other stories for themselves. Could you clarify that a little bit? I'm kind of like, how did the folks originally get the stories? I mean, if they're an oral culture, maybe they don't all read. So somehow they have to get that original material. So
yeah, and that's a good question. And it's really hard when you're doing an overview of orality in this way that we've done it. I did it kind of fast and quickly. That one of our lessons would be using a mentor. So a mentor is very, very important. A mentor is someone who is literate, who can read and write. So it has to start from there. It has to start from somebody who can give the story to the person whose oral preference, who doesn't read or write. And we actually have the women break up into groups and learn and actually practice that, taking a story and telling it to the group and having them tell it back. And so they're learning how to be a mentor. And so they mentor a woman for once a week for maybe 1 or 2 hours, and they'll share a story once a week. And so after a year, these women will have 52 stories in their oral Bibles. And so it becomes really effective. But it really is about the mentoring 2 to 3 women individually on a weekly basis, and giving them stories and making sure the stories are accurate, helping them to identify stories so that they can share those stories to the women that they're ministering to. So I hope that helps explain.
Well, and you do have to have somebody introduce the story, either orally or audio recordings. And so one project we worked on, the project's outcome were audio recordings on a little MP3 player. And the idea that the Western ministry had was these MP3 players would be taken into the village and everybody'd gather in the circle and they'd turn it on. Well, what our teams found in the field, that they became training tools for people to listen to. And then they went to the village and actually told the story in person. Because if you get down to the really grassroots level, they look at this little recording device and they say, how did a person get in there? It's just hard for them to comprehend. And then nobody in the audio recording can answer questions. So you'd have to have a live person anyway. So the audio recordings became more of a training tool for the teams that wanted to go into the village to tell the stories than actually a listening device. For Bible, a lot of people use proclaimers and the language that, the faith comes by hearing devices and many of the other recordings. So you do have to have somebody to introduce that
Ruth?
Content.
Thanks so much for this workshop. I'm just wondering, I understand that choosing stories that are specific for women to relate to from the Bible is really important, particularly in cultures where the women are the ones who can't read or write. But I'm just wondering, at any point or at what point would you then teach other stories? Because obviously all of us learn from the whole of the Bible. Is it just that you start with ones that relate to women in order to use that as an evangelistic kind of building tool? And then do you sort of move on to including other stories that don't necessarily have women as the main characters?
Yes. And so again, there's a lesson. where we talk about using, using the story strategically. And I kind of touched on that a little bit, but we do, we actually use a agricultural kind of example. So a circle where you start at the top, when you're going to plant your field, what do you do first? Well, you have to remove the stones. So what are some stories that you could use to remove the stones in this woman's life? And so what would be the next thing you would do once you remove the stones? Oh, then you would prepare the soil. And so then what are the stories that would prepare the soil? What are the stories that would water? What are the stories that, when is the woman then you think is ready to actually come to faith? And so every woman is different in that journey. And that's where relationship is important when you're working with that. But then after they become a Christian, what are some stories that you can use to disciple them? And it just becomes the circular process is what we call it. And it's an effective way it's a strategic way to use stories to actually bring someone to faith. And so it's not a quick way to bring somebody to the faith. It can take sometimes up to 6 months or more for somebody to actually come to faith through listening to stories. So I hope that's helpful.
Does it leave some gaps though, like, in terms of if they, you want to teach creation or you want to teach from the beginning, like I'm guessing just that if we're only focusing on stories that have women as the main.
No.
Yeah.
And so what you would do is then, and that's where you would have to decide as someone who's working with this person, what do they need? And so that's where the chronological stories come in, because it is important to know the whole of the Bible. And so stories, starting from the very beginning to the very end, actually tell the whole story of the Bible and are very effective. And so we do promote that. Yeah, that's really important. But you need to just decide that as someone who's working with.
And you'll learn along the way what stories open the door. So there is in the orality movement, there are people who would say it's got to be, chronological Bible storying. So you always start with creation. But then there are other lessons we've learned. Our friend in Ghana, Africa, works among animists. And I said to him one time, well, what story do you start with from the Bible with anyone? And he said, Jacob's ladder. And I said, Jacob's ladder? And he said, yeah, because they're animists and they don't believe there's a connection between the earth and the heavenlies. And here you tell a story about a man who wrestles with angels. They come down, they descend, and it turns on the light to get them thinking that there can be, Jesus who came down from heaven. And so in every culture and context, what you're looking for are stories that open the door to thinking. Now, at some point, I would say in the Bible side, you have to start with, and creation's a great discussion, because every culture has a creation story. How did their village come to be? What is their belief? You can trade stories and listening groups and begin to open the doors. But that is, sort of the big question. The other big question in Bible orality movement is, what do you do with Paul's letters that begin to teach us about the church, because they're not narrative? And we've been experimenting, how do you connect those to narratives and such? But that's a great question.
Thank you.
And you can actually connect, verses to a story. So if it's similar, you can do that also. So, there's many ways.
We had a question in the chat if you have these trainings in Spanish.
Yes, I have Bridges for Women in Spanish.
Okay, thank you.
Catherine, did you have something you wanted to say?
I did. I was going to make a suggestion for a future gathering like this, and that would be to talk about the connection between the outside world and the world of the community and the people group that you're serving, because it seems to me that that's an extremely important link, that, and you're talking about people who are familiar with the culture, who know the language, and are able to be that bridge. But if you don't have a good bridge, you're not going to be successful in the way that you want to be successful. So I'd really love to hear some stories about how you have made, how you've made an entrance for yourself into different communities and cultures that were really effective, rather than just some outside people coming in and telling stories, etc. I've got some stories of my own, and some things I've done wrong and not so well, and some mistakes I've made, and some things that have worked. So I think making the connection between the outside world and the oral people groups is a hugely important thing to understand in order to be able to do this successfully.